Um, so, yeah, paper one is done. I couldn't get it out today in terms of grading. Um, Only a few of you should not go into ministry, so you're fine. We'll do like survival, and we'll vote people off the island. No, they're all great, plenty of opportunity to just shift and update and fix things for paper three. I understand in an ideal world you'd have paper one before paper two was being written, but it just can't work out that way. A lot of you were in Theology 1, so this feels very normal. For those of you who weren't, don't sweat. We're good. We got you. In fact, I'd probably have paper one and then paper two back to you relatively in quick sequential order. Is the way it works out. So, yay! And we'll move on to paper three. Thankfully, there's no final, nothing like that. You just got to do paper three and you're done. So, those of you who have other classes with, horrible professors that work you into the last second, remember me. You come into your kingdom. Just kidding. Half of you are probably like, no, 3 papers is worse than exams sometimes. So this weekend, this last third, we're looking at the church and eschatology. The church, I could have said ecclesiology and eschatology, there wasn't enough room on the screen. Eschatology being the key word here, eschatology is not just the end times. It's not just, is there a rapture, when is it, all those things. Eschatology is, in many ways, the very fabric of what the New Testament is saying based off of the Old Testament, looking forward to this time of consummation. And yet also the fact that in some ways the consummation has happened in the man Christ by his resurrection. And that's what Paul is saying when he says, if Christ is not resurrected, just give it up, because all the things that we would hope for in the life to come are based off of his having achieved it. So eschatology is more than just end times, but of course we're going to talk about end times. And the church is more than just the building, and more than just the people, and it's more than just the denominational distinctives that, of course, we're going to talk about. It's also, what does the church do? And one of the things the church does is not only preach the word, but administer the sacraments, and we'll talk about what sacraments are. And so that's the kind of big arc for this weekend. And it's a big deal because, one of the reformers, Calvin, argued that the Apostles' Creed is actually 3 parts. It's based on the life of God, the Trinity. The way we often say it sounds like there's 4. It sounds like there's the Father, Son, Spirit, and then there's this church, resurrection from the dead as the 4th piece. And I think it's important to realize all the stuff we talk about when we get to these topics is nothing beyond what the gospel is intending. So it's not a 4th category. In many ways, it's, as I'm going to say now, the ongoing application of salvation. Of course, that's been a big arc, a big separating of at least themes for me. It's the redemption accomplished, the work of Christ, what he did, all those pieces. What I like to say, the spectator sport of it. The stuff you get to add nothing to. The stuff that doesn't involve you at all. You're not even born yet. Obviously. But then last weekend we were talking about that when we start dealing with the more personal questions of what do we believe in predestination? Okay, is God sovereign over all my decisions, including my faith? And then ongoing justification, sanctification, all these very us-focused concepts, that is the application of the work of Christ by the Spirit. That's what we were saying last time. This conversation, though, the reality, though, is that the what Christ has done extends beyond just merely you and me. It can't just simply be you and me, because the fact of the matter is again, last weekend we were looking at the fact that it does apply to you. It does apply to individuals. It has to. It can't just be, neat ideas that don't actually touch the heart and change the life and those realities of being a Christian. The problem, though, with this, the problem in the bloodstream, in particular for evangelicalism, is that we think the gospel is just entirely about us. Every verse is about you. All the yous in the Bible must be you individually as a person. And so, this is one of those usually humorous comments that people make where someone takes a verse commenting on Israel and they apply it to their own life. Now, that doesn't mean that the Bible wouldn't echo things that God was faithful to Israel and he'd be faithful to you. That's certainly true. But you have to realize you stand in a time and place in God's work. And so therefore what he's doing is not just you, and Christ is not only for individuals. Therefore, what we're talking about this weekend is not a completely alien category to what we were talking about last time, because what the church is supposed to be, and then this question of what will it be when Christ consummates and brings all things under his dominion. All of that is equally as much the ongoing application of Christ's work, as I'm going to say here, salvation corporately is ecclesiology or the church. So, yes, it touches you personally, but it also touches that other person next to you in the pew. It also touches the pastors and the deacons. It touches the family that's there on Sundays. And therefore, the application of what the Spirit is doing is corporate. And that's one of the things we're going to unpack biblically is Paul is just as concerned to talk about how the Spirit knits us together as one body, as much as he is to say you individually need to think about living a life that is sacrificial. And the challenge then with this is not that you're dumb. No one's ever really saying that. The challenge is it's very hard when you begin your faith walk, when you come to faith, it is very much about you. It is very much about I have decided to follow Jesus. It is very much about I once was lost, now I'm found. And it's like everything about your faith becomes just about you and what's changed and what you see going forward and all the callings in your life. But again, as I'm just saying, you then meet all these other people in church. And doing church together is always messy. You jam a bunch of sinners together, you're going to get messy. But that being said, there's also this ultra clear call in the New Testament to live as one. But the fact of the matter is this side of eternity, you can't live utterly as one. Sometimes, even when Paul can say live as one, he can say kick that guy out for doing that. In 1 Corinthians, that the public sexual scandal that was going on, he said, that's not a good thing. Tell him that's not good. Tell him he's no longer a member. And then you get to 2 Corinthians, and he's like, okay, he said sorry, let him back in. The whole thing. And we're going to talk about all that with church discipline. But that being said, there is this relationship that we have to work together. And it needs to be said at the beginning, as we walk through this, always keep in mind, Paul's insistence on unity is not based on the fact that they're always experiencing it in the churches that he's writing to. The extent to which he has to encourage it and tell them to keep doing this is in many ways a symbol of the fact that this is not easy. And discerning, this is a pastoral point, discerning people who are being divisive in an anti-New Testament way, divisive to the point of saying, no, I follow Apollos and I follow Paul, and you've got that kind of guruism going. That's one thing. But there's also the kind of division where someone has they're just seeking the evil within the church. They're complaining all the time. They're trying to undermine things. They're trying to tear down the things within it. And I've said this before. Discerning when that is happening versus you just have a very plucky individual who has lots of hard questions can sometimes be hard. Because just because the person walks up and asks lots of challenging questions and has lots of hard things to say and questions to ask doesn't make them divisive. But yet Paul says when it has approached into the world, when it gets into the point of being divisive, you don't allow it. And this is where you get that you don't say to one another, I don't need you, this whole piece. So we're going to go through ecclesiology, but this is still salvation in this corporate sense. Christ didn't come to save a bunch of exclusive individuals to go live in exclusively individual heavens unto yourself. Rather, all the images of the life to come are of us all together, of all us as one, all before the throne, that type of thing. And the eschatology thing as well. A thing evangelicals don't major on as much as they probably should. But because of what Christ has done, there is a cosmic restoration that is afoot. I mean, most of us, if we were talking about the gospel and what Christ has done for us, would not do like Paul, where in the middle of Romans, he stops to point out that creation itself groans for the redemption. I mean, for you and I, we tend to not equate the cosmos, what God has made in creation, as equally going to be restored in the new heavens and the new earth. And by the way, it is new earth to come. We don't get harps and wings and float around disembodied forever. And so what ends up happening is you realize there is a cosmic dimension. That there is this amazing sense in which God himself will restore all of this back to as it should have been. And in many ways, that's the ultra theme of the scriptures. The ultimate biblical theology is that there was creation, there was the destruction of that creation, or at least the marring of it through sin, and then there's this cosmic restoration of you, of us as a body, and then of the heavens and the earth itself. And that what's going on here is not just he loved your soul and saved it to get out of this earth. In fact, it's not even that at all. But rather, the war that we feel between us and this life is itself part of this cosmic restoration. Lots of people, when they get to end time stuff, as we'll see tomorrow, lots of people like to say, well, it's just who cares? It's dumb. Or there's lots of dumb examples of people predicting the end is going to come next Tuesday at 4 p.m. And therefore, lots of silly things happen. One of the, I don't know if I mentioned this before, one of the sillier ones was some pagans opened up a website with one of the recent ones about take care of your pets after the rapture. And they, of course, pre-charged before, because how else are they going to charge you after the rapture? They pre-charged like $500. They'd come get your pet and take care of it. It made money hand over fist because people were being silly. And I want to laugh on the one hand, but then say, that stinks because those are probably just lay people that didn't know any better. But you hear that enough, and you just start going, eye roll, this idea of the end, the eschatology debates. I'm going to approach it from a different flank and just say, look, when you begin with this way and start talking about the fact that we all agree that the scriptures point to this consummation, this end, and that in fact, in a strange way, your salvation is both fully complete and not yet complete, because there is something to come. That reality means we all live in that tension. And that reality also means we all make lots of mistakes that you have to give a lot of grace for. I mean, why do Christians have so much trouble distinguishing their Christian perspective and whatever political party happens to offer them, but we're the real Christian party? And I don't just mean Republicans or Democrats. I mean, this is like a human history problem that we always jump after a king or an emperor or a presidential nominee or whatever. The answer is it's hard this side of the eternity to understand that we're in the world but not of it. That both and thing is the challenge. And Christians mess that up a lot, but they mess it up in the New Testament. This is what Paul has to remind them, that your kingdom is not of this world. You're from Jerusalem above, not from Jerusalem below. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to walk towards that. And then when you get to the end about the debates on how the end looks, I'm going to tell you it's not as complicated as it sounds. You don't have to, dogmatically choose one side. In fact, the end times is one of the rare doctrines where we have equally committed people on seemingly contradictory positions, and we're just like, yeah, that's fine. We might not agree in terms of church denominations to join up based on some of those decisions, but we always, as I like to say, at least you believe something's happening in the life to come, and that there's going to be some work that Christ is doing. But as you'll see, there really only are two perspectives in the end times. And all the isms and the pre-post blah 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 rapture stuff is just variations of the two sides. So I'll hopefully help you see through some of that stuff. I always hated end times conversations whenever I was learning about it, because it felt like Legos, and you just pull that piece out and you stick post-trib rapture in there, and you just pull this out, and you do, and nothing made it sound more abstract and made up than just the isms that were spanned across the board. And then through some other stuff I was doing and reading and just trying to teach it, I just realized there's two perspectives. And again, within them, you have variations, but we'll get there. Tonight, though, we're going to look at the church, the doctrine of the church, also called ecclesiology, which is just the study of the doctrine of the church. So we're just going to call it the church. This is one of the subjects that, again, you just have to know the family. Evangelicals don't write a lot of stuff on this. They don't talk about it as much. I mean, if you were to go to, assuming there are still bookstores in this world, if you were to go to a Christian bookstore and stand in front of the shelves, you're not going to find big books on this is the church. You will find lots of books on other things, doctrines of salvation, all kinds of issues that we take very, very serious. But I remember in seminary, because I wanted to study the Reformation. The big issue in the Reformation, of course, is the doctrine of the church. That is actually what the fight is about. Because when Luther and others after him come out and say, no, the Bible says this, the response wasn't, no, it doesn't. The response was, do you submit to the Pope? Are you telling me that the Catholic Church can be wrong? And Luther really only got in hot water when he said, yeah, I'm saying the Pope can be wrong. Before that, it was a theological fight, but when you get to the doctrine of the church, that was what really split, because Luther said the church can be wrong and it needs to base itself only on the Word of God, not the Word of God and the voice of a Pope. And so what ends up happening is you realize the church was the big one, so I was like, all right, I'm going to read on this. I'm going to get some categories. I have no idea. I don't even remember this part of systematics because we kind of danced over it. And I went to, this is back a long time ago, 2003. I went to the seminary bookstore. It was a big one. It had more books than anything. You know how many books I found on ecclesiology? 2. They were both written by Catholics. And at the time, there really wasn't much out there. It's been rectified since. There's been some more. A good friend of mine is in the midst of doing his doctor of ministry degree, and he's writing it on the doctrine of ordination. What does it mean to be ordained? What do ordained people do differently than non-ordained people? And just that whole debate. Just at a big view. And he said, Ryan, what books are out there? I was like, there's less than that. Less than on this. There's less books on that than on ecclesiology itself. And he goes, well, that's maybe the problem. I said, yeah. I said, the problem is it's a challenge. Now, it's not to say we don't have views in the church. It's just rather when it comes to prioritizing conversation, we put this towards the back of the train. I mean, the fact that a Gordon Conwell exists is just an example of that. The fact that you all have different governances, not radically different governances, but you have different governances, different church denominations, those types of things. It tells you that what evangelicals do is they lead with their soteriology. They make relationships based on your commitment to the gospel. I mean, how many people have you known, oh, you love Jesus? You got, okay, fine. All right, we're going to differ in a lot of stuff, but I love you. We're good now, as long as we got that core down. But what you realize when you start looking at church history is at times, other groups, Catholics and Eastern Orthodox in particular, do not lead with that. They lead with their doctrine of the church. And so for a Catholic, their main question is always, yes, we'll have a talk about doctrines of salvation, but do you want to be under the Bishop of Rome? Will you submit to the Pope? Will you join a Catholic Church? Because ecclesiology is the out front doctrine. In Eastern Orthodoxy, a little bit less so, but certainly that way. And so it's usually jarring. You meet your Catholic neighbor, you start talking about the church, and they're like, oh yeah, we love the gospel just like you guys. Justification by faith alone. Yep. You're like, that's just not how I thought this conversation would go. And you go, all right, well, why aren't you Protestant? And they're like, oh, well, I have to submit to the Pope. I have to do this. And then you go, whoa, that's not what I meant. I meant, do you love Jesus? And if you love Jesus, then come out, all kind of stuff. And you realize that Catholics lead with their understanding that the church is the building, the community, the Bishop of Rome that one has to be affiliated with. And there is no Protestant denomination that comes really even close to that level of visible unity as the requirement for being in an Orthodox community. Anglicans will sometimes talk about it in a way that can make evangelicals feel as if they do that. And there is certainly a group called Anglo-Catholics that kind of say this, but not really. But still, even Anglicans don't believe this because, hello, they left the Catholic Church. So certainly at some point they believe you can leave. But the church is a vitally important doctrine, and it's an important subject. It pops up all over the New Testament. In some ways, it's the assumption of the New Testament that what the gospel does is make a church. It makes something. We can all talk about the fact that the church is not a building, it's a people. Well, it's a people that meet in a building, so there's some building somewhere that you're meeting in, but it's not synonymous with the building. It's also not synonymous with that group of people that are meeting in that building. So you start to unpack it and you go, there's a lot here. The questions that tend to pop up are three. The three sort of categories. What are the marks of the church? What is the relationship of the believer and the church? That's that question of individualism and corporate identity, corporate membership. And then the question of authority and governance. Authority and governance, of course, is just, why do some have bishops? Why do some have no denominations? But, that kind of stuff. But it's more than just how you arrange the deck chairs. It's also what is that governance and authority for? It's that question of, okay, there are people that are ordained. Maybe you witnessed an ordained service. Maybe you ordained yourself. And you go, what did that do? They laid hands on that person, but I don't feel like they're any different. They're still the same jerk I knew before. I'm just kidding. Well, it's actually true because you're still a sinner. So you're still the same person you were before. My favorite is to always like a week after an ordination service, if I'm friends with the person, is to ask the spouse, the wife, like, hey, so is any difference? Same. Nothing's changed. And you realize, okay, ordination's not infusing them with holiness and making them some kind of monk suddenly. So there's something that ordination and authority is setting them off to do. And then you realize that when Paul says that people in ministry are to be given a double honor, there's something there. We live in a world that's trying to demarcate ministry, ordained ministry, as if it's not that important. But I think what the Bible is actually holding out is something different. A lot of it, as I'll say, is the language that we say, let me put it this way. The word ministry has gotten slippery. So I can minister to, it's become a verb now. I can minister to somebody. It used to be a noun. That is the minister. Now I minister to people. That's very, very true. I'm going to argue that the New Testament calls that loving people or discipling them, which is it's not just the elders or the deacons that disciple, but that everyone is in many ways discipling the younger generations, the younger folks, the newer Christians, that kind of stuff. So there must be somebody in charge. And so what does that look like? And what I'm going to resist under that section, when we get to it, is the kind of hyper-professionalization that we've got going on as well. Because what I think is going to, I'm sort of pre-saying it, but I need to. What's happened is we created a vacuum of the fact that we don't know what authority and governance structures are supposed to do. And so that either gets filled with two things. It either gets filled with somebody who asserts themselves in a dominance position. And we've all heard of stories, or maybe hopefully not too much, but experienced sort of spiritually oppressive leaders who think that they're, if Jesus is the head, they're the neck in the body of Christ. They make the head move. And so that they have to come to Jesus through them. They become mini popes. The other side is we fill it full of lots of Dr. Phil stuff, how to be a good leader, effective, 7 habits of highly effective people, and it's just simply business stuff warmed over. Obviously, I think there has to be some element of knowing how to keep the lights on and pay the bills, but what ends up happening is you have to be careful. So, move it to that. First of all, the marks of the church. Notice the way we even use this word, the marks of the church. The language is very, very hesitant. And the language is hesitant for a reason. The language is hesitant because if any of you have ever done global missions, or if any of you have been on the internet in the past, 5 years, you're aware that there's a global church. And you're aware, perhaps, either through your church or other things, that people worship and look differently than you. And I don't just mean clothing and skin color and ethnicity. What I mean is the way they do life together sometimes looks very different. Let me just give you a very simple example, not the best example, but it's a simple one. So on our main campus in Hamilton, the biggest one, they're all big, the campuses, they're almost too big. But that one's huge. They got little dorms and cafeterias, and they all live there. It's like college part 2 in some ways for them. But one of the places that the main campus has become a residence for is a lot of Asian students that come over, particularly Korean students. And so a lot of these Korean students come over. There's a long legacy at our main campus of that. And what's very, very funny is to watch all the North Americans interact with Koreans on things like how to pray. So one of the things they'll offer is, okay, we're going to have a prayer service, prayer time together, just not led by anybody, but so all can get together and pray. How would you and I do that prayer? Quietly, popcorn prayer. I'll open, you lead, you close. So Jesus has got to pick up and hang up the whole thing. And we're very used to letting others speak. There's nothing biblically for or against that per se. But what's our emphasis? We want every voice to speak out. We want those not praying to hear the prayer, particularly if it's a time of personal prayer. You want to hear maybe what's going on in someone's life. When the Koreans come, though, they don't pray that way. They all pray loudly at the same time. Because apparently God can listen to a lot of people praying at once. It doesn't need like shh, I'm praying. The awkward thing where 2 people start at once and then they keep hesitating. That whole thing. They don't care. They just go. And all the North Americans are like, this is weird. Like, what am I doing? Can I pray too? Like, yes, you can pray. And you're seeing like something as simple as they pray differently wakes you up to the church can look different. This is basically the principle of wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am. And that, there are lots of varieties of how we can be structured and look and even act in some ways. And I don't mean liturgy, I just mean just that type of stuff, life together stuff. I'll give you another personal example. When I lived in England, and you would think if there's 2 cultures that would be more similar, it would be, Brits and North Americans, that we would do something kind of, we were once kind of united back in some century, I forget when. I'm just kidding, I don't forget, but you would think we'd be similar. But I went to church, and one of the things, if you're tired and you want a Sunday nap, don't say yes to going out to lunch with somebody in Britain, because what happens is they say, hey, you want to go over for lunch? You're thinking, sure, free lunch, all right. And you go there, and you all sit down, and you have a drink, juice, water, whatever. It's England, so it's probably beer. And there's just sitting there hanging out. And then you realize after about 45 minutes, no one's cooking anything. They're just hanging out. You're like, are we ordering pizza? What's going on? You get this whole and then you realize, then somebody starts to cook, and they start bringing it out dish by dish slowly. and hours seem to go by, and then maybe before dinner they'll let you go. And they expect you to stay the whole day. A friend of mine, this happened to him. I got in the habit of not telling North Americans when they come over about this, just to watch what would happen. And this happened to him. He got invited over, and he was exhausted. He had just moved there and all stuff. And at one point, again, imagine this in our world. At one point, and maybe this is the case. I don't know. I don't know all of your experiences, but anyway, the wife says, "Oh, hey, you seem pretty tired. I've made up the bed. You can just go in there, lock the door, take off all your clothes, just jump in the bed, take a nap." How many of you would sleep well? It's like, it's just sitting in there in somebody's bed. But that was an assumption. That you're tired, there's a bed right there. I mean, no, can I just eat fast and go back to my bed? It was our rushed North American experience. Those are ticky-tack small things. But the reason marks of the church is the language we use is because you have to say, okay, throughout time and space and around the globe, what marks the church? What identifiers give you the evidence of it? The other reason this is hesitant is because you and I don't see into the heart. We would admit that of each other and of anybody you meet actually face to face. And that's certainly true when you think about, 300 years ago in a church in some city somewhere else. You're not going to have a way to tell who's really in, who's not. But what you would do is you would look for marks. Well, what's going on there that marks this as a church? And there are different answers. There are different marks. There are different things that people suggest mark the church out. They're not all radically different. They're not all massively different. But there are two tendencies. But the fact is there are different marks, different strategies for determining. Yeah, it's trademarked. So. Just in case anybody's watching. But the fact is there are certain marks. I mean, famously, two colleagues in the Reformation had two different marks. One had 3 and one had 1. One just said, preaching, just gospel preaching, and let the rest will kind of take care of itself. And the guys like, no, we need 3. We got to add some more in there. And there's, I'm going to not walk through all this too much, too explicitly, but just realize when we say marks of the church, this isn't from on high. This is just the typical standard way that people approach the question. All right, so what are they? Well, first of all, the marks are an ancient concern. This is not just something evangelicals cooked up, last year. Actually, from the beginning, the earliest records we have of the early church, they are trying to help people understand what identifies a church and what identifies any of the countless numbers of rituals in the pagan world, the Roman world, as well as the Jewish world, because the Jewish synagogue for several centuries could look functionally like you were walking into the church. In fact, we have a sermon from a guy named Chrysostom in the 4th century where he's saying, if you go to a new city, you go into a building and you think you're having church, ask them, are they a synagogue or are they Christian? Because you might be in the synagogue and you don't realize it. Which tells you what? There's still lots of Jewish converts in the church, and the model and the style of it would have looked very similar. The building would have looked the same. Very stripped down, simple building and all that kind of stuff. And you might have shown up and missed that. Now that's probably not all that common per se, but what you're seeing is people saying, know what the church is and know where the marks are. And so the early church is very much driven to this, and they give us actually the first set of marks that you're going to immediately recognize, that the church is one holy Catholic and apostolic. One holy Catholic and apostolic. This is historically the first set of marks, the 4 marks. As I'm going to tell you by the end, what the Reformers, what Protestants will end up saying is, it's not that these are wrong, it's that these could be misleadingly overly simple. That it's too easy to assume that you're one holy Catholic and apostolic just because you call yourself that. And so they add to it other couple pieces that challenge any lack of oneness, holiness, Catholicity, and apostolicity. All right. So these are the 4. Now, immediately, depending on your church, depending on the groups that you minister to, the one that's going to be controversial, and it doesn't need to be, as I'll say, is Catholic. What does Catholic mean? But let's start with oneness. Oneness is based on the work of Christ. It's based on the fact that he has made all things new. That all the things Christ does is not for himself. Again, obviously, he came for us. And it's not simply, by the way, the post-resurrection narratives where he's suddenly saying, now go make disciples, do all this stuff. But from the beginning, he's saying, I've come to gather my people. I've come to make this new, as I say, your family. And he demarcates not an ethnic identity with Jews, but rather that the new family, the people of God, of course, will have Jews, but will have Gentiles as well, and they will be centered on faith in him. That it's not enough simply to have one's ethnic identity belong to the Jewish faith, or if you're a Gentile, to conform to that ethnic identity marker, like circumcision, kosher laws, etc. And that's Paul in Galatians straight up and down. It's just, hey, some people are telling you that you have to be like us to be God's people. And he's saying, never is that the case anymore. And so what Christ has come is he's centered us on this family, and therefore all of the language of oneness in the New Testament is assumed that that's what Christ is doing. He's bringing us together. He's making us one. Notice the creative language in that. It's not a social club. We didn't say, hey guys, you want to get together, have some bylaws, make a church? Sure. Rather, there's this language of when one is drawn to Christ, drawn to him, that the lordship of Christ unites us in a way, makes us humble in other ways, and lets us suspend our own desires for the sake of each other. This is, in many ways, what Acts is modeling and showing in other places all throughout it, because what you see is that community coming together and taking care of each other. And because of that, the oneness of the church is always implied. I'm going to walk through some verses here. But first, oneness is more than being kind. In terms of this doctrine, oneness is more than being kind. This is an Americanism. To be one, to be unified, is simply to be nice. Simply to hold your tongue if you disagree. I think that's actually impossible. There's a willingness to disagree in a very humble, life-giving way that has to occur in the church. I think it's one of the reasons why some of you have found this place very freeing, is because you can actually get to know somebody that differs with you on a non-essential issue, and you can say, I totally disagree, but now I love you, and so I have to like you. No, just kidding. But you get this sense of the differences are not so great that they should make us suspicious in that sense. And we're certainly not a crosscut of all of evangelicalism by far. But nonetheless, kindness has become the new stand-in for oneness. And what ends up happening is this type of kindness just basically means you disagree, but you just keep it to yourself. Or you're not sure about something and you just don't say anything. And that's not what Jesus holds out. Jesus actually, and Paul and other places, talk extensively, and they give lots of examples of how one actually can disagree and can challenge. Paul will use the language of rebuke. One can speak these things in a very life-giving way. Because when kindness is just simply hold back and don't talk about our differences, talk about the challenges of the way we don't always get along, when that is the case and you just hold back, you're actually disrespecting the other person. And I think that's a biblical norm. If you respect the other person, then you actually are able to speak. I disagree. The difference is it's not being unkind, obviously. You're not supposed to be rude about these things. But kindness is kind of this hold back, say nothing. If it's awkward, don't talk about it. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, says, I appeal to you that all of you should agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you. But that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. Now, this type of verse is often cited as an example of that hold your tongue, be kindness thing. And they usually focus on the first half. That you be in agreement with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you. That you be perfectly united in mind and thought. But as you start thinking about it, how hard is it to even know the minds and thoughts of somebody else, to the point that you can agree and speak with the same voice if you don't freaking talk about it? If you just simply say, well, we're gonna watch a movie. We're not gonna talk about anything. We're just gonna always be we're just gonna keep going. If those differences aren't discussed, how can one achieve this? And of course, when you start to unpack 1 Corinthians, this is the opening set of verses. When you start to unpack it, what you realize is there's lots of gurus who are coming into to the Corinthian community, telling them what is and what isn't true. And they're then dividing up into Hogwarts houses to see who can be the best. One following Apollos and this type of thing. And what he's saying is I don't want that type of division. This is not competition. Rather, the differences of perspective within reason are to be embraced. And fundamentally, then theologically, you have this unity that you need to get to. And then when it becomes to different perspectives in that unity, it's okay to have those as long as it's within that spectrum. Now, that being said, in a lot of pious talk, the language of oneness is mostly today, I find, used as shame tactics. This is particularly true of Protestants, where people will say, oh, there's 90,000 denominations. You guys are horrible. You divide over nothing. You hate each other, all this type of thing. And you get this sense, you get this a lot also when one denomination leaves another one. When a group says, you know what, this church is throwing everything out and they don't seem to really care much about the Word of God, it's time to leave. And everyone goes, how dare you leave? The church is supposed to be one. Really, you were persecuting me until now, but still. That being said, this idea of oneness is not, on the one hand, it's not you're supposed to talk about it to get to it, but the other piece is it's never complete in this life. It's a strange thing because Paul does say it needs to be something you're working towards, but it is never complete in this life. See, Paul in 1 Corinthians is dealing with an ultra-fractured community in which he's saying, y'all better get along. You better stop this. However, later in Ephesians, he talks about this outward goal long into the future, where the goal is, as he says here, quote, until we reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. How many of you think in this lifetime you're going to achieve to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ? Hopefully nobody raises their hand. If you so, we'll talk to you at the break. But the wholeness of the fullness of Christ is always what Paul's language of that ultimate completion of these goals. It's got the end in mind. So all the language of do it now is based on the idea that it will only fully be realized in the life to come. And that there will be divisions and tensions and fights and challenges and frictions and all these types of things, but that the goal is towards that end of ultimate unity. What that challenges us towards is what's your posture? Is your posture to, and I don't mean macro, I think in general we can all affirm we love each other, but I mean, what's your posture with the co-pastor in your church or that church next down the road that's in your same denomination, and they do things slightly differently in terms of maybe programming, structure, change? Is your instinct to find fault with that, and you become the Sneetches with stars that are doing it right, and they're the failures that are doing the old model of church? And by the way, if that's your church, that happens a lot. But I'm not thinking of you. That happens a lot. That idea of, well, we're doing it the new way. Yes, that's right, the new way. It's us. I was just talking to a friend and lives up in Boston now. He's going through this. Lots of churches in his network, and they all do things slightly differently. And he said, I thought we were supposed to be one, but we seem to just mainly be in competition. And we grieve if my brother's church is struggling, but quietly we feel very happy because we're struggling. They're struggling because we're doing well, that kind of thing. So on the one hand, if you have those cankers growing up in the heart, you got to challenge them, because the biblical model seems to be that even if there's someone that disagrees with you in terms of practice and experience, if you can legitimately say they are a gospel church, you should actually rejoice when they do well. Even if they do well and your ministry and your church isn't hunky-dory right now. It's not your church, is it? So if ministry is thriving, don't turn up the nose and say, well, we're small because we do it right. That's usually the counterbalance. You usually start with, we're going to grow because we're doing well, and it's like, we're not growing? Well, that's because we do it right. We do it right, and we don't have itching ears here. That kind of thing. But that's the one thing, is the cankers of that can grow up very easy. Pride is a big thing in ministry. However, the other side of it is, let's say you have achieved a level of unity, and that is not a tension within your heart, and you've learned to hit the mute button when your mind wants to say those things. The reality, though, is some of you are going to be too driven towards kindness and conflict avoidance that you won't last in ministry. Because the fact of the matter is if you won't actually confront a problem and say no, we need to say no, and say yes, we need to say yes, you are what they call a peacekeeper, not a peacemaker. If you know that difference. Peacekeepers are the ones who just don't want the kids to fight. Peacemakers are the ones who get the kids to agree so that they don't fight. It's the difference of perspective. But if you have that reality, what you need to realize is that unity will always come at the far side of that challenge. It's not to say that everything's a fight, but come on, when you're in, just go to, if you haven't yet, ask your church if you can go sit in on an elder or a board meeting or a budget meeting. And watch, because suddenly these very holy folks will seem not all that holy at times, when they bicker over how much spending is going to go to the nursery or something like this. And you realize that there's a lot of these challenges. You got to work, and that reality, though, is about the faith and is about knowing and the doctrine, knowing doctrines and the truths of these things. But it's deeper than that. But it will not be achieved in this lifetime. There's always going to be that happening. I mean, again, one of the things for me is to point out, if Paul planted churches that later descended into chaos, you're going to have ministries that might be susceptible to similar patterns. Again, it's not that you get the programming and the structure and the mission statement right. That's not what guarantees successful, thriving, growing, renewing ministries. But rather this sense of both, I strive for unity and I strive to do the right thing, and may God be praised no matter what. And on the other hand, this place is full of sinners, and sometimes we gotta just call a spade and go after it and really disagree and sit in a room, and sometimes we might get hot under the collar, but we gotta do it. Because if you avoid that stuff, it just gets worse. This, by the way, is also why almost every Protestant denomination has plurality of leadership. It's not because we like to have lots of people on our website that are listed as elders and deacons and other things, but it's because we realize that when one person runs everything, it's very easy to achieve an appearance of unity. But that could be a completely false unity based off of the guru, the leader, the one man. You just make little popes. Protestant churches are by default messy, because what you end up doing is you have a group of people that are called and set apart to lead, and they don't always agree on everything. And again, this is, if you haven't seen one of these meetings, go and enjoy the way God is. As I like to say, God is perfectly happy to let weak bozos like you and me run His church. That's the foundation of your ministry. It is not that he did call you and give you talents, but He called you despite your weaknesses. And everyone else around is going to have them as well. I only learned this. I didn't learn it in the church environment, but I learned it, just in terms of this campus. Some of you may or may not know, but when I was hired 6.5 years ago, I was just me. I was Rambo. They sent me into a campus by myself. We had no trouble with unity on this campus. It was just me. As long as I wasn't fighting with myself, we were all unified. We didn't even have staff meeting. We didn't need to. We all agreed with myself. In my old office in our old building, I used to, those dumb endurance posters like thriving, and it's like somebody shoveling something. I had teamwork, and there's a bunch of people rowing a boat, and people would be like, "Oh, that's nice." And I'd be like, "Yeah, we got a lot of teamwork around here." And so it was funny only to me, but in this whole thing. But that was right. Then we hired people, and then we started to hire other people, and then we grew a staff, and then that's when I was like, "Oh, this ain't easy. This is not." Even if things aren't descending into problems, it's still you have to account for the challenges of other people. Somebody's sick. Somebody's not feeling well. Somebody had a bad day. And you're walking in, Mr. Optimist Peppy. I'm usually the one that had the bad day, by the way. And they're walking in very optimistic, and we go to staff meeting, and things aren't all on the same page. It's that type of everyday stuff where unity gets challenged. So if you have a Narnia view of unity, that you're all just going to be saints sitting around a table and the light's going to shine on your budget and tell you what to do, it's not that way. It can be very challenging. But you have to have neither the Narnia view nor this ultra pessimistic view that everything's horrible and no one knows what they're doing either. So when you deal with that, you start to understand what unity is. And then lastly, our unity is based on the life of God. Unity is based on the life of God. Not enough people notice this. This is absolutely the case. John 17 is your standing place. This is Jesus, they call it the high priestly prayer, at least that's what we call it today. And it's Jesus in the garden. This is what he's praying to the Father. And he says, "I and them and you and me, so that they," this is referring to us, "may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me." That the basis of our unity, doctrinally, is not the shame it and claim it model of you ought to get along. I mean, you've probably, I've said that to my kids. You've probably said that, if you have kids, you've probably said that to your kids. Come on, you should love each other, stupid jerks. Like you get that kind of action where you're saying, "Come on, kids," and they're all like, "No." I mean, that's not an encouragement to it. I can say that one of the most effective things with at least my two kids that speak well, my 2-year-old doesn't know anything. He just likes Moana. He just wants to watch Moana all day long. That's all he cares about. But for my older ones, what draws them closest into unity? When Mommy and Daddy show them what unity is and talk about it. Or we talk about forgiveness, and we talk about all those types of things and how you love. And if you were to ask my kids, why did the neighbor girl push you? She would say, "Because she's a sinner." I said, "All right, did you ever push your brother?" "Yeah." "You ever been mad at me?" "Yeah." "Okay." You understand where this is going? If we're all on the same page, then the encouragement towards unity is deeper. And what Christ is saying here, and what John records, is this language of the perfect unity is based between Father, Son, and Spirit. That idea that and this has always been more remarked on, the great mystery that God within himself is one God in perfect harmony. And yes, it's a deep mystery and it makes your mind cramp. But the fact is, what he's saying here is just as he is one with the Father, that is what will be our unity together will be like in him. That's a deep mystery. It's the same thing when Paul is talking about how husbands and wives ought to love each other, and we only focus on the human relationships. But in the end, he goes, this is just a mystery, but I'm talking about the church. That when you look at our unity at a doctrinal level, it actually begins to start sounding it approaches that same mystery as God himself. Because what ends up happening is you and I, according to our sin, have no right to get along, agree, and be one with each other. But there's a great mystery in the fact that we can be. And that evidence here is even said to be something that the world takes note of because of it. I heard a sermon not that long ago, and the preacher was saying, what the world needs to do is look in on us and see people that outside of our building never get along. People of different, ethnicities, people of different political backgrounds, apolitical, Democrat, Republican, whatever. People who have different economic status ranges, people with different education levels, and that there's this strange, how do y'all get along? And the answer is, I don't know, love Jesus, and that's almost the answer. That what Jesus is saying here is that the ideal is that we have some ability, we have through the life in the Spirit, some way to be one in a way that others can only guess at. We just look at the relationships between men and women in the world around us. Mostly they're predatorial one way or the other towards each other. This is particularly the case of single folks, that kind of thing. It's all about how you size up, measure, rank each other according to looks or social status, whatever it is. How ought the church to live? Of course, nothing like that, where people are not objectified and looked at in that way. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. That the world around us will always drive to disunity, because what else would keep them together? Whereas what we have is something different, and that's what we're looking at here. The counterbalance, just at the end of this, is that in biblical language, pride and vain ideas or vain philosophies is often the root of disunity. This is 1 Corinthians talk about vain philosophies of the world, but there's also this language of pride. Pride. Proverbs is big on this as well, on the question of pride, thinking very much of yourself, your cleverness. You're clever and talented, therefore you are the best thing in the world. That second one is probably easier to spot, but when it's paired with the first one, that's it. You are usually the last person to recognize that you're being cocky until someone says, you are unbelievable. You're unbearable these days. All of your ideas are just freshly minted from heaven. And everyone else's challenges to this, you don't want to hear it. That type of stuff. And pride and pairing that with this idea of your own vain ideas, vain philosophies, is the root of disunity. It's often where it goes. Rarely is it just hot-blooded anger. Usually it's a thinking highly of yourself and therefore pushing against those who are different from you. This is what James is just furious about. You would actually tell someone to sit at your feet because you think you're better than them. Of course, he's dealing with economic status there. But of course, the application is wider than that. The elevation of self, the pride. The practical payoff of that, by the way, is get people around you who will tell you straight if you're gone too far. And by the way, usually that's not a family member. Almost never is it a family member. Unless it's absolutely true, and ask your friends if it's true. Unless it's absolutely true, your spouse will usually not always call you out directly. Or if they do, they won't do it in the direct way that you often need it. But you need that person that goes, stop it. Just privately. They don't need to call you out publicly. Excuse me, preacher. You don't need to do that. That's division. But when they go up to you and you go, hey, look, you're swaggering now. You care more about the way you look on stage in terms of the way people perceive you, not looks, but you know what I mean. If you don't have that, then it's very, very challenging. And here's the other little practical payoff of that. Some of you will end up in church contexts or ministry contexts where people are very critical of you. And you'll think, I can't get arrogant here. I can't get prideful here. Because people every week are telling me that they don't like this, and they don't like the color of the carpet, and they didn't like that talk, and they thought the potluck dinner was cold, and the whiners. That is actually deceptively one of the fastest places you can get prideful. Because everyone around you becomes the idiot, and you stand above, and you tolerate their silliness because you're better than. That's I'm telling you get into this understanding of pride. You realize how deceptive it is that to use the parable, the prodigal son knows he's been eating pig slop, the older brother has nothing within his framework to tell him that he's done anything wrong. But he is very much judgmental in all those types of things. So that's the thing to watch out for in terms of oneness, in terms of life together. It's not unachievable, but it's not perfectly achievable. And it's not achievable by simply being kind, as I said. Any questions on that? Sweet. Holy. Holy is, for all the emo people throw at the word Catholic, holy is the one that they get wrong the most. Holy is one of the ones that we really get wrong. As I say here, it's the most difficult word, not based on the fact that the Bible isn't clear about it. The problem is that there has snuck into our language an unbiblical understanding of what holiness actually is. If I were to say, oh, that person's very holy, what would you hear? Ethics. You would hear that they are just sort of Gandhi in terms of their ability to live this sort of perfect life, right? Is that the biblical doctrine of holiness? It's not horribly wrong. I mean, it's not as if holy people are completely amoral. But is ethics the central part of holiness? No, actually. Holiness, I say here, is not about perfection. Again, though, to be holy is to be set apart in a way that will lead to change and will lead to these things. But notice, as I'm going to say as we go through this, the Bible continually calls the church holy, though all the evidence of it is that it's completely unholy and full of sinners. So if it's all about ethics and doing the exact right thing all the time, the church is not holy, is the only conclusion you can come down on. And in the evangelical world in America, there has been a tendency to separate people into what can only be called cultish small sects of communities where their whole thing is, we live holy here. We do it right, perfectly right. It's these little communes. And what's strange is they look exactly like 1 Corinthians. They're all sleeping with each other because now you can sleep with each other if you're holy. They're all doing all kinds of things. They're very set apart. There's this holiness fad in American evangelicalism that you got to watch out for because it's unbiblical. So you might say this: holiness is being, as I'm going to say, holiness is being set apart by God, and behind that it pulls the change to be different. But the setting apart for a different purpose is not the same as being changed. So they are two sides of the same coin, but one goes before the other. So it's not perfection. Holiness isn't here. So I say holiness is not perfection. It's not just simply, it's not being saintly or perfect in the sense of ethics. What is holiness in the Bible? It's a common thing that's set apart for a biblical use or a godly use. An everyday thing, a common thing, set apart for a use that is above and beyond its own worth, you might say. This is why Paul can say that we have this treasure in jars of clay. That's the language he's talking about. The great example of this, by the way, throughout most of the Bible, is the temple. All those sticks of furniture and candles and utensils and things are called what? Holy. Now, obviously, it's not ethics if you can take a thing, a bowl, and set it apart, a candlestick and set it apart. You can take things and make them holy. They're not ethically bound to do things, obviously. So holiness is about taking something that is common and setting apart to be used differently. So therefore, when the Bible calls us holy, when Peter says, you are a holy nation, he means that we are set apart out of this world, though we look no different. It's not as if we got some infusion that made us superheroes over against all the people around us, right? Rather, we are just like every other man and woman around us, but we have been set apart as this holy thing, this cherished thing, this thing that's being used differently, being treated differently, because we are considered holy. And therefore, the set apart thing the holiness, the ethics of it, the things we want to see change happens, but it happens because we were set apart first. Again, this is another way of saying what tends to happen when people muddle up two different distinctions is they take what happens later as the thing that happened first. But all y'all, to speak plural, all of us, when we came to faith, didn't really have a whole lot of holiness in the sense that some people use it now. We were this exact same people we had been a second before. However, over the course of our life, we have become more obedient, the being set apart has changed us. But holiness is being set apart in this life. So therefore, a holy church still has unbelievers. A holy church still has unbelievers. This is the one everyone goes, what? You know, the whole thing. But you have to look no further than Judas. The disciples themselves are called out, set apart as the 12, and there in the midst was Judas himself. It's not the only example, of course, but it's certainly one of them. If you want to go, okay, well, the disciples are a different category, and that was done for the redemption story, that's fine. There's also the parable of the wheat and the tares. The fact that in this life that there will be unmistakable woven together of the true wheat and the tares that are in our midst. There's even people that do ministry and get to heaven and Jesus says, I don't know you. And it's not that Jesus is shocked, it's that everyone around him is supposed to be like, what? Like, I thought he was in, like this whole thing. You might say that that is a comment about the Judases in our midst as well. You don't see the heart. You don't know the truth from the false believer. There's also 1 John where people have left the community. And John uses this language of they went out of us because they were not of us. There's this language of we didn't know that when they were here that they were not truly one of us. But the fact that they left is the evidence that they left. So that reality throughout the New Testament, Paul is saying lots of things about the fact that there are still people in their midst that name Christ but act in a way that's contrary to Christ. He starts giving lists. No one who names Christ continues to act this way. And it's because the people are going, I don't know, they said they love Jesus, I guess they can do whatever they want. And the whole thing. And he's going, no. There's certain things that will eventually show that they truly don't believe anything. So the fact of the matter is you're a holy church, a holy nation, yet there is unbelievers in our midst. So it's not the ethics. There's not something you get that's perfect in this life. Secondly, true believers in this holy family, in this holy community, are still capable of, yes, even horrible things. I'm thinking here of David. Thinking here of Peter, denying Christ. All those things while having walked with him, in Peter's case. David is a man after God's own heart, but what does he do? He doesn't, I actually get a little annoyed by this, he doesn't commit adultery with Bathsheba. What he commits is essentially rape with Bathsheba, because the text is pretty clear, at least in terms of its implications. She's not given an option. And then it's bye. And then he murders it to cover it up, because even the language, she goes, hey, by the way, I'm pregnant, and she sends the note, is like, who? I mean, it's like this language of like, oh, man, I thought I'd cover that up. And then he covers it up again with murder. It's borderline rape and certainly murder. It's not, well, he just had adultery. It wasn't like they had a one-night stand and they were drinking at the bar and they did something dumb. It's predatorial, and yet he's still got a man after God's own heart. How do you know he's a man after God's own heart? Because when he's confronted with it, he's utterly repentant. And he utterly, it's Psalm 51, he's absolutely rends the flesh and says, metaphorically speaking, rends his sinful nature open and says, he goes to the point of saying, I am a worm. It's the only place in the Bible, by the way, where a human being is referred to as a worm. The Bible doesn't call us that. David calls himself that, because of what he's done. But he completely goes into repentance for this. In the restoration of Peter is the same way. Peter actually is getting, I don't know if you recognize it, I think it's jumping off the page. Peter's actually getting a little flustered with Jesus by the third time he's asked him, Peter, do you love me? It's like, yes, why do you keep asking? And Jesus says, love you, feed my sheep. So the fact is that true believers are still capable of this. Evidence that they are true believers is not perfection then, because again, stick around the church long enough, you'll see people do dumb things. You'll see people destroy their lives. You'll see people destroy their marriages. You'll see all kinds of sinful actions. Holy is not perfect. Now, the problem with this is you get a little bit of this the wrong way, and you get 1 Corinthians. Because what 1 Corinthians says is, oh, we just love sinners. We're just gonna be salt and light, love some sinners. And then it's like, he's sleeping with who? Oh, that's fine. We're just gonna, his stepmother, weird. Okay, that's fine. You know, this whole like, we just let things happen because we're gracious. And that's what Paul says, that's not gracious, that's stupid, stop it, kick him out. But still, the fact of the matter is there's lots of examples in the Bible and lots of examples in history of people who get caught doing things, they're chastised, they diminish, they go away, and they learn repentance. Now, one little caveat here. Occasionally what happens is people in ministry get caught doing something. Let's say they embezzled money, or they not bad, but let's say they took a little bit of money here and there, and well, they make ends meet. And, by the way, if you don't know this right now, you don't touch the offering plate in service if you're a pastor. You can actually go to jail for it, for one. But this is why you have the deacons look at it, and you usually have them go 2 by 2 to do it. And there's a famous case not a couple years ago of a New York pastor who would count the money himself, and less would be deposited in the bank account the next day because of this. Of course, everyone is aware of scandals involving sex and adultery and all this type of stuff. But there's others as well. There's all kinds of things. Graciousness is not simply letting the person get back to the restoration of every authority they had before the fall. That's one thing I think we've lost our way on, I think, as an evangelical community. Typically what happens is if somebody commits a real serious wrong, they go away for about a year or less, and for increasingly less. And then they come back and they do a teary, I'm sorry, and no one knows where they've been sometimes, and if they've been dealing with it or in counseling, and they can do, I'm sorry, and God has restored me to my exact same position of authority and the place where I abused my authority the last time. Now, is that ever possible? Of course it's possible. With proper restoration and the people that are around this person restoring them, all stuff. But we live in an unbalanced world where people can kind of sneak away and not change, and they come right back in to positions of ministry without any pass and go. Just like, yep, no big deal. And I think it needs to be said, the church has better resources on this, at least in terms of their practice. Their practice is you can come back, but you're not getting the keys to Dad's car anymore. You're not going to get to run the church anymore. Not without sufficient outward dealing with it with those who are around you. You don't just get to go to the next city and start over. Now, I don't know how you stop that in the modern world, because people can pick up and go anonymous and move wherever they want sometimes. But within communities and denominations, this happens too frequently, where the restoration is based on grace, but grace is not kicking them out of the church. So if you're saying they're still a Christian, it's okay to doubt if you want to give them all the restoration of their authority back immediately. It's not a race to replace here, guys, or restore in that sense. In other words, what I'm saying is people who stumble out of ministry for these types of issues, historically, are not allowed back into ministry very quick. Sometimes they're told, look, you have all kinds of signs of pride and perhaps doing this again. Why don't you just stay a layperson for a while? It's not saying you're not a Christian. It's just saying you're not going to go back to leadership. I mean, Paul warns about not everyone should want to do this, right? So maybe throwing the person that's struggling with their own ego problems back into ministry isn't the best thing for them. So that being said, I don't think you're graceless for challenging the quick way people just say, I'm sorry, and go back. I mean, I would love at I've seen this occasionally. I would love at one of those denominational meetings where the person is standing up saying they want to be restored, for the families that they've either stolen money from, or the people that their families they've ruined, to come and sit there while they talk. Now, that would be considered borderline abusive, but if you're going to say it in private, say it with them sitting in front of you. I don't think, in other words, I think the church had a little more hard edge on this. You don't get back in that fast. Now, heaven forbid this happens to any of you. But that being said, let's say we bat 1,000 in this class and none of you do. That being said, you will find this happen in whatever denomination or community of network of churches you're in. Because what happens is we say, okay, grace means we forgive and forget. Well, yes, but that doesn't mean that the calling on their life is necessarily restored, even if the grace of forgiveness is given to them. Now, again, heaven forbid you hear me saying that sinful people in ministry must be removed and never restored. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is what we have typically right now is not restoration, but avoidance. I witnessed one of these things at my friend's church a couple states away, and the guy had just destroyed. I mean, he was almost predatorial himself in the way he destroyed a couple of marriages through sexual actions. And the guy had been gone for about a year, and he came back, and he at the meeting, my friend was telling me about it. He said he wouldn't even refer to it as sin. He kept talking about my past problems, and I just texted him. I said, "Did anyone ask him if he's received counseling for sex addiction?" He said, "No." I said, "Has anyone asked him if he's looked at pornography in the last year because his wife left him over the allegations?" He said, "No." And I was just like, "Come on! Like, this is the stuff. This is where you just go for the jugular. Like, have you dealt with this?" Instead, they allowed the language of, "Well, I had some past problems, and now I'm restored." And he said people were worried that it would sound graceless to ask hard questions. And I said, "It's not graceless. No one's saying you're not a Christian. No one's saying you're not sorry. What we're saying is, have you dealt with this in that way?" And we could probably fill the rest of the night with stories that you've heard or know personally of pastors being abusive, pastors being, and I don't just mean sex, I mean, again, all kinds of abuses. One of the privileges I have is lots of students will come to me and tell me stuff that's going on because I'm safe. I'm not in the denomination. Sometimes you have nobody else to talk to that's not gossip. So you're like, "Hey, this is a challenge." And not a few occasions people have said, "My pastor is clearly stealing money, and he had a DUI, and there's all kinds of things that his life is hitting a tailspin, but we don't know what to do." And generally I always say, "Well, are you an elder?" I'm like, "Yes." You're there to do something. That's your job. Now, I don't mean you just fire him overnight. What I mean is he has people around him that should be helping in that regard. Is all this easy? No. But holiness is not perfection, and therefore you have to take into account even the possibility of egregious sin. It's holiness. And again, it's not that we're talking about the fact that we're the worst, most rotten people on the face of the planet. I mean, if we name Christ, we are being led into sanctification. But holiness is being set apart so that sanctification comes next. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I mean, this is all kind of like, everything I've learned about it is different.
No, yeah, yeah.
So I was asking the scripture what Peter said, and God said, "Be ye holy, for I am holy."
Yeah. Yeah.
Is he telling us to be like God?
Yes, very much. But God's holiness is not that he does right. It's not his ethics. It's not, I mean, in some ways that's not a statement you would make. God is, well, I'm not going to go there. Basically what happens is God is holy in the sense that he is set apart and it will not touch sin. He is set apart from it. He is removed from it. But in that sense, we are being called to be like God, but again, it's not an ethical claim at that point. It's be set apart as God is set apart. Now, again, think of it like a train. The setting apart is the locomotion that's pulling it out. Behind it will come obedience, discipline, holiness in the sense of, all the things that we usually use the word holiness for. I'm not so much saying never use the word holiness when you're talking about holy living. Maybe that's what I mean is holy living is set apart living. The living, though, is where you actually act it out. But this is why infants can be set apart, and they live, only for milk and naps. They can be set apart as an infant. Like, no one's going, how dare you act selfishly, you infant? Like, you need to be holy. Like, no, they're set apart in that way. So maybe another way of saying it is holiness is bigger than just how we act, though it pulls the actions and our living behind it, with it. Because one can be holy while, in a manner of speaking, looking very unholy and ethics-wise. I mean, again, right after conversion, like we're now considered part of the holy church. We've been brought into it, but we look the same as we did a second ago before we bowed the knee. And so it might be a question of root and fruit. Root of holiness is being set apart and called, and then the fruit of it is the life that comes after it. Yeah.
Do you make a distinction between someone who is in the church but not a Christian versus someone who's in the church and is a Christian? Would you consider them both the church, or would you say one's a church and one's not?
Yeah, we'll get into that. That's really where the Reformation's of coming down. Is it's very easy to say that. Well, I won't go there yet. The church in the Reformation era will say, when we say church, we mean visible and invisible. Then they use that distinction to talk about the true faith, true believers, and the unbelievers. But yes, they are the church. They are in the church in a visible, covenantal sense. They are in the community. This is what Hebrews 6 is saying. These people who have left, it says they tasted the mysteries. That's sacrament language. They participated in the sacraments. They had Lord's Supper. They were baptized, and they trample them underfoot is the language that they go out. It's a rejection now. It's not. The question there is that there are people in the community that will be part of the visible covenantal church that are not true believers. Just like not all Israel was true Israel. There were some with heart circumcision, and there were some who just got their foreskin cut off, and they never bowed the knee before God himself. The remnant language, we use that a lot. The remnant. There's a remnant within the visible church. The places people go astray are two, falling off both sides. One is to say, who cares? So people will look excessively like they don't care about the church and just kind of do really awful things. And people are like, well, he's a member, we're fine. That kind of laissez-faire. The other side is even though Jesus says you're not going to separate the wheat and the tares, we still try really hard to get all the tares out. And it's just like, you can't get to that level, at least not in terms of your practice. So what I'll end up saying is when we get to the question of church discipline is mostly about public scandal and the things you see happening. You don't go looking for it like in a witch hunt sense of like, did you lie on your taxes? Yes. I got you. Like, you're out. Like this whole thing. If you start looking for it, then what you end up is the old Augustine quote. Like you end up with a church of one, because basically the standard is one you self impose. Yeah. But yeah, the church in a broad notion of it can have both believers and unbelievers. What the Reformation will say, the visible church will have that. The invisible church is the church that's visible to God himself. And he knows his sheep, and he knows his people. But the reality of ministry is God doesn't give us that Excel spreadsheet as to who's in, who's out. So you're always going, I'm going to guess. Like I was saying this last time as well about membership is based on a credible profession of faith, not we know they're saved. Because all we have is the words from their mouth, that they name Christ and love him. Now, you can be optimistic. I mean, come on. You don't have to walk in fear of this. But the fact is everyone who's been in ministry around church long enough knows of that one person who everyone thought was the best, most God-fearing man or woman ever, and then they find out they're like, just doing something really bad. Just like, and then they walk away and they never come to church, and all that stuff. I do suspect, and I'll end on this for a break, I do suspect that some of the spiritual abuse some people experience is an attempt to preemptively remove the tares. And so we add, well, you better not dance to the list of things that mark you as a real Christian. Like, the old joke that started at Wheaton that, they outlawed dancing because they outlawed premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. The whole thing. And so you get this whole thing of like, one thing is right, don't do premarital sex. Dancing is not even nowhere mentioned in the Bible, for positively or negatively in that sense. And so we're going to add that as the thing that's the really bad one. And so a lot of that's that I grew up in a fundamentalist world and got yelled at for, my skirt was too short, or I wanted to play sports or something. I've heard all these stories from folks. That's the kind of, we're trying to figure out who's the real weed, and we add on laws and rules and regulations on top of it. So.
Have you ever heard of PK?
Oh, the preacher kid thing? Yeah.
Those kids be bad because their parents so strict on them. Like what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm gonna pass this
Yeah. Well, I think this is when Paul says, when people that are coming up for leadership, when Paul says, see how their kids treat them, I don't think I think he just knows. I mean, he just knows. Like, the language he uses is that the kids honor and fear them, which is a Jewish way of saying love and respect in a more 20th century language, if I were to translate it. The sense of, you can smell when the kids just utterly despise them because there's something that you're not seeing when they go home when they're in the car or something, versus just they're a teenager and they hate everybody. You can spot the difference. And the one time I really saw this was in my church back in Orlando. There was this guy that was a newer Christian, and he just would ask a billion questions. He was very active and showed up at everything. And his son looked like he wanted to murder everybody and just hated being there. And everyone read it as like, oh, this, just a typical teenager. The problem was everyone who knew him outside of those situations said he was very normal and like he had friends and stuff, and he didn't act that way. And he come to find out his dad was sexually abusing him. And it's like, I'm not saying that every case of that is obviously the worst, but this was like a horrible, like the kids signaling there's problems usually. And I think Paul's saying if their kids hate their parents and particularly hate their dad, there's something, there might be fire if you see smoke.
But I was brought up that the sinner and unbeliever are two different things that the Holy Ghost would deal. I know better than that now. I can listen to your lecture.
Yeah.
But they were saying like the Holy Ghost won't deal with unbelievers.
Mm-hmm.
But I've seen the Holy Ghost work with believers and unbelievers in the same church service. And in the temple. But I was brought up.
Mm.
That was taught that.
Yeah. What they might have been is a verse I'm going to give a little bit later. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about God does. We don't care what happens outside of this building. Like who are we to judge them? He says, but we judge us. Sometimes you get that language of we don't care what the world does, we care about what the church does, which is true. But yeah, you get these like a distinction becomes sometimes artificial. That's right. Okay. Take a break and we'll come back.